In 2013, a geneticist working in Scotland found himself staring at a result he had run on 3 separate occasions, and all 3 times the machine returned the same impossible answer. He wasn't looking at the DNA of some unknown individual. He was examining the maternal bloodline of the most photographed woman of the 20th century, a woman whose face had moved more magazines off shelves than any monarch in recorded history, whose every ancestor had supposedly been identified, catalogued, and preserved within the pages of England's most distinguished aristocratic record books. And what he discovered inside her cells simply should not have been there. A genetic marker so extraordinarily rare that across a database of 65,000 people, only 14 human beings on the entire planet carried it. 13 of them were living in India, 1 resided in Nepal. Not a single one could be found anywhere across Europe. And yet there it was, sitting quietly within the direct maternal line of Diana, Princess of Wales. He ran the test once more. The result held firm. He had 2 samples drawn from 2 different living relatives who had never once crossed paths, and both of them independently carried that same marker, which ruled out any possibility of error. It wasn't contamination. It wasn't a smear on a laboratory slide. It was genuine. It was real. And it had been concealed within the most celebrated bloodline in Britain for more than 200 years. Here's what you need to grasp before we move any further. This story unfolds in 2 halves, and both of them are going to disturb you. The first involves a genetic discovery so statistically unlikely that the scientist himself was forced to persuade his own colleagues he hadn't made some kind of blunder. The second concerns the actual human being behind that marker. A woman who was erased so thoroughly, so deliberately, that even her own descendants, the people walking around with her DNA woven into every single cell of their bodies, had absolutely no idea she had ever drawn breath. They had accepted a different version of events entirely, a polished, comfortable, and respectable lie that had been handed down at family tables across 7 generations. The biology told one story, the family told another, and for 2 full centuries, those 2 accounts ran parallel to each other, never touching, never colliding, until a small plastic tube of saliva brought them smashing together. So let's begin at the point where the world believed it already had all the answers. By 1981, when a quietly spoken 20-year-old named Diana Frances Spencer walked down the aisle of St. Paul's Cathedral to take the hand of England's future king, her ancestry had been studied to the point of exhaustion. Genealogists regarded the Spencers as something close to a model English aristocratic family. Old money, old land, old blood, traceable back through dukes and earls and the kind of names that fill the index pages of peerage volumes. The assumption everyone held, the assumption no one ever felt the need to question, was that her bloodline was about as thoroughly English as a bloodline could conceivably be. Centuries spent on country estates. Centuries of carefully arranged marriages between the most suitable families. Centuries of what that era called, with considerable smugness, good breeding. And here's the thing, that assumption wasn't merely careless. It formed the very foundation upon which the British aristocracy had constructed its own self-image. The notion that these families were genetically apart from everyone else, that their blood was somehow purer, older, more native than the rest, that belief was the backbone holding the entire class structure in place. So when 2 of Diana's maternal relatives, both of them 3rd cousins on her mother's side, submitted saliva samples as part of a genetic genealogy research project, no one anticipated anything other than confirmation of what the official records already showed. Everyone expected to see an unbroken English line stretching back into the rolling green countryside of centuries past. Instead, the test moved back through that line 1 generation at a time, mother to mother to mother. And somewhere around 7 generations earlier, it encountered something the record books had quietly and deliberately removed. Now pay close attention here, because in order to appreciate just how airtight this discovery truly is, you need to understand why these particular women were selected and why the specific type of DNA being examined matters so profoundly. Both women traced their descent from Diana's mother's side through an unbroken succession of mothers and daughters, and the test wasn't examining ordinary DNA. The kind that gets reshuffled and remixed with every new generation, half coming from your father, half from your mother, tossed together like a shuffled deck of cards. It was examining mitochondrial DNA, and mitochondrial DNA operates by an entirely different set of rules. Just sit with that for a moment. Mitochondrial DNA travels exclusively through the female line from a mother to every one of her children, but only her daughters carry it forward into the next generation. It does not mix, it does not blend with whatever the father contributes. It travels intact, essentially unchanged, like a sealed envelope passed from hand to hand across hundreds of years. a letter no man who married into the family could ever touch, alter, or corrupt. Every husband who stepped into the Spencer line across 200 years left traces of himself scattered throughout the rest of the genome. But the mitochondrial line cut straight through all of them, untouched, sealed, incorruptible, which makes it the nearest thing genetics can offer to a tamper-proof record. It is a thread you can trace backward through time, mother by mother, with complete confidence that nobody rewrote it somewhere along the journey. And that is precisely what makes what follows so shattering. Because while the family was occupied rewriting the paper records, and they were, as you're about to see, the one record they could never get to, the one buried deep inside the body itself, kept right on telling the truth. The paper record said European, the blood said something else altogether. The genetic marker the researcher identified belongs to a haplogroup called R30b. And R30b, together with every one of its branches, is South Asian. Not occasionally South Asian, not ambiguously South Asian, entirely, unmistakably, exclusively South Asian in origin, with no credible alternative explanation anywhere in sight. It does not appear in native European populations. It does not turn up scattered across the Mediterranean or tucked away in some forgotten pocket of the Caucasus. It originates on the Indian subcontinent. Full stop. So when it emerged within the sealed maternal line of an English princess, it could point to only one conclusion. At some point, approximately 7 generations before Diana was born, a woman of South Asian descent had married into, or more precisely, had entered that direct maternal line. A woman whose existence had been carefully, methodically smoothed out of the official story until she became little more than a ghost within her own family tree. She had a name. We know it now, Eliza Kark. And for more than 200 years, that name appeared in no Spencer genealogy that carried any weight, in none of the distinguished record books, in none of the biographies that rushed to celebrate Diana's ancestry when she married into the royal family. She had been erased so thoroughly, so completely, that the very people carrying her DNA had no idea she was the source of it. So who was she, this woman who officially did not exist? Eliza Kark was born around 1790 in a city called Surat, on the western coast of India. And if you want to understand how a woman ends up scrubbed from one of the most extensively documented family trees in the world, you first need to understand the place that shaped her. Surat in the closing decades of the 18th century was no quiet backwater. It was loud, it was packed. It was among the most active port cities on the entire subcontinent. A dense web of warehouses and wharves where the sea breeze carried the mingled smell of salt and tar and waiting crates of pepper, indigo, and raw cotton stacked for ships heading toward Europe. Traders from a dozen different nations walked those streets. Persians, Armenians, Portuguese, Dutch, and increasingly the men of the British East India Company, who arrived hungry and ambitious, eager to build their fortunes far from the chilly drawing rooms of home. Into that world, Eliza was born. And here is where things become complicated, beautifully, revealingly complicated. Because Eliza Kark carried 2 distinct heritages, and her family would later weaponize one of them to conceal the other. Pay close attention to this, because it is the hinge upon which the entire cover-up swings. Eliza's father bore an Armenian name, Kwark. And Eliza herself, when she actually put ink to paper, signed her letters not in English, not in any Indian script, but in graceful Armenian characters. Now, in the cold arithmetic of colonial society, that single detail was absolute gold. Because to be Armenian meant being Christian. To be Armenian meant being, in the eyes of the British, respectable, civilized, European adjacent. The kind of lineage a man could quietly weave into his family history without stirring too much scandal. Armenian was a heritage you could openly mention over dinner. But here's the catch. Here's what that one signature could hide. But the blood running through her veins simply could not. Eliza's mother's line, the maternal line, the one that passes mitochondrial DNA down unbroken from mother to daughter to daughter. That line was South Asian. That was the line carrying R30b. So while the Armenian name sat proudly on the surface, visible, useful, a handy half-truth, the deeper reality ran beneath it, locked inside every single cell of her body, lying in wait 200 years for a geneticist with a saliva swab to finally read it aloud. Just sit with that for a moment. The cover story and the buried truth were both genuinely hers. The deception wasn't even fully a deception, it was a selective truth. Armenian, yes, on her father's side, chosen deliberately because it could be used to smother the part that colonial society found unacceptable. That is a far more insidious form of erasure than a straightforward fabrication. You don't conjure something from nothing, you simply take the convenient half of a person and allow the inconvenient half to quietly vanish. And now we arrive at the man who stepped into Eliza's life and altered everything. His name was Theodore Forbes, a Scotsman, a merchant of the East India Company who showed up in Surat somewhere around 1809, young, driven, and posted thousands of miles from anyone who had ever known him. And there, in that sweltering, teeming port city, Theodore and Eliza found each other. The official version, the one that would later be committed to cold ink, described Eliza as Forbes's housekeeper, his domestic, a servant under his roof. And maybe in the narrowest technical sense, that was a label someone scrawled on a document at some point. But what truly passed between them was something else altogether. And we know this because the truth endured. It endured in their two children, a daughter, Catherine, born in 1812, and a son, Alexander. And it endured in the letters, because Eliza was not some maid sweeping his floors. The correspondence that survived reveals a woman who translated for Forbes, who moved fluidly between languages and communities that he, a foreign outsider, could never have navigated on his own. She built his connections. She helped him conduct business in a place where business rested entirely on trust, on knowing who to approach and how to approach them. In a city where a company man's success or ruin depended on relationships, Eliza was in every meaningful way his partner, his gateway into a world that would have remained permanently shut to him. For a few years in Surat, that arrangement held together. The children grew, the household ran smoothly. And here's the thing that's easy to overlook across the gulf of 2 centuries. For a stretch of time, this was something resembling a proper family. A man, a woman, 2 small children in a house near the sea. Whatever the paperwork called it, that is what it was. But colonial society was shifting, and shifting in a direction that left absolutely no space for a woman like Eliza. Here's how it worked. In the earliest days of British expansion across India, relationships between company men and Indian women were commonplace, almost unremarkable. Many of those men, far from home for decades at a time, built full lives and raised families with local women, and society largely looked the other way. But as the years rolled on, the rules grew tighter. The empire became more rigid, more consumed by racial hierarchy, more intent on drawing firm lines between ruler and ruled, between European and Indian, between what was considered respectable and what would destroy a man's future entirely. As Theodore Forbes climbed toward a partnership in Bombay, the kind of position that could set a man up for life, wealthy and established, the way he calculated Eliza's place in his world began to shift. A man on the verge of becoming a company partner with a fortune ahead of him simply could not afford complications at home, a common law wife of Indian blood. No matter how much she had helped him build that fortune, no matter how many years they had lived side by side, no matter how many children they had made together, she had become, in the cold arithmetic of that era, a liability, a barrier between him and the life Bombay society was prepared to offer him. And so Theodore Forbes made his decision. He left. He walked away from Surat, away from Eliza, away from their children, leaving them all behind in that port city while he went off to construct a new existence in Bombay on his own. A respectable life, a social life, the life of a company man going places, and here's the thing, he didn't even have the courage to tell her himself. He never sat down across from her and explained. As plans were drawn up for the children's futures, as choices were made about where they would go and what would happen to them, Forbes handled everything from a distance, routing it all through intermediaries, through other men's hands and other people's letters, as if writing to Eliza directly was something a man of his standing could no longer afford to be caught doing. The woman who had once translated the world for him was now someone he could only address through go-betweens, like a debt being quietly cleared, like a chapter being shut before anyone who mattered could read a word of it. Just sit with that for a moment. Think about what those months must have felt like for Eliza. The man who had shared her bed, her years, her children, had become a silence on the other side of a wall she had no way of crossing. She was still in the same city, still alive, still well, still raising the 2 small people they had brought into the world together. And the messages that reached her now arrived secondhand, filtered, formal, the language of arrangements, not affection. She must have understood very quickly what was unfolding. A woman that sharp, a woman who had read men and moods and the tangled politics of a trading port well enough to be genuinely useful to a merchant, she would have read the situation too. She would have known exactly what it meant the moment the letters stopped arriving in his handwriting. And this is where the story shifts from something you think about to something you feel. Because after Forbes had gone, after the years had rolled past and the man himself had died, a bundle of letters turned up, far away in Scotland on the family estate, among the papers and belongings that follow a man into death. Somebody discovered a small packet of correspondence written in a script that nobody in that cold northern house could decipher. Strange characters, unfamiliar hands. Letters that had crossed an ocean and outlasted the very man they were about, sitting in a drawer like a door no one had ever thought to open. They were Eliza's letters. And when, generations later, they were finally translated, what they revealed was this: Eliza could not write English herself, or at least not well enough for what she needed to say. So she did what people in her world did. She found a scribe, a Parsi scribe in Surat, someone who could take her spoken words and put them down on paper. She dictated to him in the halting, imperfect English of a woman working in a language that had never fully belonged to her. And then, at the foot of each letter, in the one script her own hand could form, she signed her name in Armenian. That detail again, the Armenian thread running straight through the most intimate act she had left, the signing of her own name to a plea for her own child. Because that is what these letters were. Pleas. Letter after letter. The same ache buried beneath the carefully dictated words. She wanted to see her daughter. Catherine was going to be taken from her, sent across the sea to Scotland, to a country Eliza had never laid eyes on and never would, to be raised by strangers she would never meet, in a world that had already made up its mind that her mother had no place in it. Eliza, aware of all this, aware she had no power to prevent it, asked for the one thing that remained to ask: to lay eyes on the girl a final time, to hold her close before the vessel carried her away, to have one last hour with the daughter she had carried inside her, nursed, and raised in that house by the water. Try to imagine writing that. Try to imagine speaking those words aloud to a stranger so he could set them down for you in a language you did not call your own, because the one person who needed to hear them had simply stopped listening. Imagine putting your own name to a formal request, just to say farewell to your own child, then waiting day after day for a reply you already suspected would never be the one you were hoping for, and it wasn't. When Theodore Forbes perished at sea in 1820, the papers drawn up to settle his estate made the final shape of everything brutally, coldly plain. In his will, Eliza, the woman who had shared his life, the mother of his children, the companion who had interpreted his dealings and eased his way through a foreign land, Eliza was listed as nothing beyond his housekeeper, a domestic servant, a single entry on a page. And Catherine, their daughter, the little girl with her mother's blood moving quietly through her, was described as his reputed natural daughter. Reputed. Natural. The precise, dehumanizing language of a society that had terms for children like her. Words crafted to hold them at a safe distance from anything they might inherit, from any name they might dare to claim. Then the separation came. Exactly the way Eliza had always dreaded. 8 years old. That was Catherine's age when they placed her on a ship. 8 years old, lifted away from the only home she had ever known, from the heat, the noise, the familiar smells of the port city, from the mother who had pleaded in letter after letter for just one more glimpse of her, and dispatched across the world to a grey country full of strangers who shared her father's blood and none of her mother's. She would grow up in Scotland. She would be remade into somebody entirely new, and she would never set eyes on Eliza again. Not a single time. The farewell Eliza begged for. We cannot say with any certainty that she received it. What survives in those letters is the asking, not the answer. There were 2 children. Remember, Catherine had a brother, Alexander. And here is the detail that cuts in a different direction entirely. Alexander was also sent to Scotland, also uprooted from his world and dropped into the cold. But Alexander, as it turned out, could not endure it. He was homesick. Homesick in the way only a child torn from everything truly knows how to be. A deep and immovable longing for the place, the warmth and the life that had been stripped from him. And so in time they sent him back to India, back towards something that resembled home, but not the girl. They kept the girl. Sit with that for a moment. The boy who could not stop mourning for India was returned to it. And the daughter, the one who carried that ancient maternal thread, the one whose cells held a marker that would one day leave a geneticist speechless 200 years later, she was the one they held fast to. She was the one kept in Scotland, kept within the family, kept and quietly reshaped and folded into a new identity, until the India inside her became something nobody spoke of, and eventually something nobody even recalled. The thread that would travel generation by generation, daughter by daughter, all the way down to a woman the entire world would one day know by a single name. That thread remained in the cold country. It endured precisely because they refused to allow her to go back. And Catherine grew. She grew up in Scotland and she did what survival required of her. She learned to live as though India had never existed at all, as though there had never been a port city, never been a mother dictating letters to a Parsi scribe, never been a farewell begged for across an ocean. She married, and she married well, the way a girl carefully folded into the right household was expected to. And in marrying well, in becoming respectable, In becoming acceptably and unquestionably one of them, she carried something forward that not one of them could see, and that she herself almost certainly never understood. In every single cell of her body, untouched and unchanged, she carried Eliza within her. She carried the marker. She carried the sealed letter that no will, no voyage, no renaming, no silence stretching across 2 centuries could ever open or alter or wipe away. And so it moved the way it always moves, quietly, invisibly, mother to daughter to daughter. From Catherine it began. It traveled downward through the generations, each woman passing it along without ever knowing she held anything at all, the way you pass on the color of your eyes without ever intending to. Down through the years, it moved through a daughter and then her daughter, down to a woman named Ruth, and from Ruth to a woman named Frances. And from Frances, on the 1st of July in 1961, came a baby girl. They gave her the name Diana, Diana Frances Spencer, and inside that newborn, in the mitochondria of every single cell, rested the unbroken thread running directly back to a port city on the western coast of India, to a woman who signed her letters in Armenian script and pleaded to see her child one final time. Now, here is the part that ought to genuinely make you pause, because when those results came back, when science finally had something to say, somebody had to deliver the news to the family, and among the people who received it was Diana's own maternal aunt, a woman who had spent her entire life inside the family story, the Armenian story, the respectable story handed down at dinner tables for 200 years. And her reaction was not horror. It was not shame, it was delight. Surprise and genuine, warm delight at discovering that Indian heritage ran through the line, that this hidden woman had been present all along. Think carefully about what that actually means. For 2 centuries, this family had carried Eliza's real DNA inside their own bodies, while repeating a story that erased her entirely. The biological truth and the family myth traveled side by side within the very same people for 200 years. The cells telling one story, the dinner table telling another, and no one able to hear the contradiction until a laboratory in Edinburgh finally forced the two to come face to face. And then consider this. Once the curtain was lifted, the ironies kept piling up. Because long before any of this came to light, the keepers of the great pedigrees, the people whose entire profession revolves around bloodlines, had already declared something remarkable, that Diana, the bride who married into the monarchy, actually carried more English royal blood than the prince she wed. It flowed to her through the tangled, illegitimate descendants of an old king's mistresses, through dukes whose titles were born from love affairs rather than from marriage. She also descended from a tragic queen of Scots. The royal family she joined had borne a surname that had been German until they quietly renamed themselves Windsor during a more convenient century. So the woman the establishment welcomed as the outsider, the one whose family had spent 200 years concealing a port city ancestor in order to appear sufficiently European, she was, by the cold arithmetic of bloodlines, more deeply rooted in this island's ancient royal line than the throne itself. But the marker is what unravels everything. Because that thread did not stop with Diana. It passed one more time, mother to son, onto her firstborn boy, the future king. He carries it. The very same rare signature that originated in Gujarat, in the body of a woman the family spent generations pretending had never existed, now rests in the cells of a man destined to wear the crown, making him in all likelihood the first British monarch with documented Indian ancestry running directly through his maternal line. The living cousins who underwent testing showed only a faint trace of South Asian ancestry in the broader measure, somewhere below 1%. The way 7 generations dilute nearly everything, except the single thing that cannot be diluted. And that one thing, the mitochondrial thread, the sealed letter, ends here, because it only ever travels through mothers. A king cannot pass it forward. So Eliza's marker, which outlasted a will, a separation, an ocean, a renaming, and 200 years of careful forgetting, will not reach his children. It travels as far as him and his brother, and then it falls silent. The thread that refused to die, because they refused to let her daughter return home, will at last come quietly to rest. So here is what this story truly leaves behind. Not a fun fact about a haplogroup, not a piece of royal trivia to pull out at a quiz night. What the DNA uncovered is an entire architecture built from shame. The colonial arithmetic that determined whose blood was a burden and whose was a benefit. The single word swapped into a record to make a woman palatable. The brutal calculation that sent a grieving boy back, but held onto a useful girl. Every bit of it was a lie draped over a living human being. Eliza was real. She loved, she translated, she negotiated, she begged, and the empire that needed her erased could scrub her from the paperwork, but it could not reach down into the cell. It could not touch the one record she left behind, written in the only ink that cannot be rewritten. Her daughter and her daughter's daughter, continuing all the way down to the most photographed woman of her entire century, and forward still toward a future king. They tried to make her vanish. The science made her impossible to erase. And maybe that is the quiet justice in all of this, that the very thing they were ashamed of is what survived, while the lie they constructed to replace her is the part now unraveling in everybody's hands. So I want to hear from you. If a single word tucked inside a dusty old record could hide a woman like Eliza for 2 full centuries, and if her own DNA was ultimately what brought her back, then whose story do you think is still buried somewhere right now, waiting inside a living descendant's cells for a test that nobody has run yet? Tell me in the comments which historical figure's hidden bloodline you would want science to crack open next, and who you think the world might discover hiding inside it.